Scientists just found something inside the walls of the Grand Canyon that is forcing a rewrite of one of the most important chapters in the history of life on Earth, and it has nothing to do with lost civilizations or hidden chambers. It has to do with what was actually living in the water that once covered this entire region, 540 million years ago, before anything with a spine existed anywhere on the planet. For decades, the story of the Grand Canyon's oldest fossil-bearing rocks was built almost entirely on the work of one man. Edwin McKee spent more than 50 years, from the 1930s through the 1980s, studying the stratigraphy of the canyon's Tonto Group, a roughly 1,600-foot-thick stack of sedimentary rock layers exposed along the canyon walls. McKee's model became the standard explanation taught to generations of geology students, describing a slow, steady rise of ancient seawater that gradually drowned the North American continent from west to east during the Cambrian period. It was elegant, it was foundational, and for half a century almost nobody seriously challenged it. McKee's tools were, by necessity, limited to what geology offered at the time: careful visual description of rock texture, color, and grain size, combined with basic fossil identification using specimens visible to the naked eye or under a simple hand lens. For a researcher working across 5 decades with those tools, McKee's model was a genuinely impressive achievement, and it shaped how nearly every geology textbook in North America described the Cambrian period for 2 generations of students. But geology, like every field of science, moves forward as its instruments improve, and the instruments available to researchers today can extract information from rock that would have been completely invisible to McKee, no matter how many decades he spent walking the canyon floor. That changed in November 2024, when a team led by Utah State University geologist Carol Daler, alongside researchers from the University of New Mexico, the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, Boise State University, and the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, published a study in the journal GSA Today that fundamentally revised McKee's decades-old framework. The paper, titled The Cambrian of the Grand Canyon, Refinement of a Classic Stratigraphic Model, used tools McKee never had access to. Where he relied on visual rock description and basic fossil identification, the new team used tandem uranium-lead dating on zircon crystals extracted from the rock itself, a technique precise enough to bracket the age of individual sedimentary layers to within a few 100,000 years, a genuine blink of an eye on a 500 million year timescale. The dating process itself involved grinding down sedimentary rock samples to extract hundreds of individual sand-sized zircon crystals, tiny mineral grains that lock in a radioactive uranium-to-lead decay signature the moment they form. Each crystal was first screened using a faster, preliminary dating method, and then the very youngest grains, identified in that first pass, were sent through a slower, far more precise laboratory technique to pin down an exact age, because the sediment and fossils entombed within a rock layer must always be younger than the youngest mineral grain trapped inside it. Stacking dozens of these individual crystal ages together let the team bracket the true age of each rock layer with a level of confidence that simply wasn't achievable using the tools available during McKee's lifetime. Mark Schmitz of Boise State University, who led much of this isotopic dating work, described the method as refining precise ages not just for entire rock layers, but for the exact transitions between individual trilobite biozones, the narrow bands of rock defined by which trilobite species were alive and fossilizing at that moment. What they found upended the tidy, single-direction flooding story. Instead of one smooth transgression of the sea, the data showed a complex mixture of marine and non-marine environments layered on top of each other, with breaks and deposition, storm-torn sediment beds, and entire faunal turnovers, meaning full changeovers, of which species dominated the ecosystem, happening in less than 800,000 years. Carl Karlstrom of the University of New Mexico, one of the paper's co-authors, described the new model as showing a much faster tempo of evolution than anyone had previously documented in this rock record. Trilobites, the armored segmented sea creatures that are the most recognizable fossils of the Cambrian period, appear to have radiated into new species and then gone extinct again at a sub-million-year pace, a rate of turnover that surprised even the researchers who found it. The reason this matters goes well beyond rewriting a stratigraphic diagram. The Cambrian explosion is the single event most responsible for the biological world as it exists today. Before it, for roughly 4 billion years, life on Earth was dominated almost entirely by single-celled organisms. Then, in a geological instant, nearly every major animal body plan alive today appeared in the fossil record within a span of maybe 10 to 25 million years, itself a remarkably short window on a geological timescale. Hard shells, jointed legs, eyes, and early nervous systems all show up for the first time during this period. Every animal group with a backbone, invertebrate ancestor line, or complex nervous system that exists on Earth today, humans included, traces its lineage back through organisms that first appeared during this explosion. That is not an exaggeration added for dramatic effect. It is the literal, direct evolutionary through line that connects modern vertebrate life, human beings among them, to the creatures fossilized inside the walls of the Grand Canyon. Scientists still debate exactly what triggered the Cambrian explosion, and no single explanation has been universally accepted. But the leading hypothesis, discussed by researchers connected to this new Grand Canyon work, centers on a dramatic rise in atmospheric and oceanic oxygen levels that began roughly 55 million years earlier. Before that oxygen increase, most life on the planet had to rely on far less efficient forms of metabolism, which placed a hard ceiling on how large, active, or complex any organism could become. Once oxygen became more available in the shallow seas, covering places like the ancient Grand Canyon region, animals suddenly had access to a dramatically more efficient way to convert food into usable energy. And that extra energy is what allowed the first true mobile, actively hunting predators to evolve. The appearance of predation itself then triggered what paleontologists sometimes describe as an evolutionary arms race, where prey species under threat evolved new defenses like hardened shells and spines at a rapid pace, which in turn pushed predators to develop sharper senses, faster movement, and better ways to break through those new defenses. That feedback loop, running for only a few million years, is widely credited as the underlying engine that produced the explosive burst of new body plans preserved in the Grand Canyon's Cambrian rock. It's worth pausing on just how fast that pace actually was. 10 to 25 million years sounds enormous by ordinary human standards, but set against the roughly 4 billion years of single-cell dominance that came before it, it represents less than 1% of Earth's total biological history, a genuine evolutionary sprint compressed into what amounts to a geological eye blink. Nothing before it moved anywhere near that quickly, and nothing since has matched that same explosive rate of new body plan diversification either, which is part of why researchers keep returning to this specific window of time and this specific canyon, looking for answers. James Hagedorn, a geologist at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science and another co-author on the paper, called the Grand Canyon an epic Rosetta Stone for geology, explaining that the team's work is helping decode it further. Because these rock layers record global changes in climate and tectonics, understanding them precisely also means understanding the environmental conditions that triggered the most important biological event in Earth's history. Hagedorn also pointed out something worth sitting with, that the Grand Canyon is not just a scientific instrument, but one of the most visited and beloved landscapes on the planet, drawing more than 6 million visitors every year according to geoheritage researchers who study the site. That combination, world-class scientific value paired with genuine public fascination, is part of why new findings from this particular location tend to travel so far beyond academic journals and into mainstream news coverage almost immediately after publication. Carol Daler explained that the Tonto Group formed during a period when sea levels rose dramatically enough to submerge large portions of the continent, creating warm, shallow marine environments perfect for the rapid diversification of new animal life. She also noted evidence within the sediment of catastrophic tropical storms, likely more powerful than modern hurricanes, striking a world that had no land plants yet and existed during a period of intense global heat, with no polar ice anywhere on the planet. Reading that kind of detail directly out of half-billion-year-old rock, down to the storm intensity of a single ancient weather event, is the kind of precision earlier generations of geologists simply didn't have the tools to achieve. It also paints a strange picture of what this part of the world actually looked like 540 million years ago. The Grand Canyon region back then sat much closer to the equator than it does today, drifting slowly across the globe over hundreds of millions of years as tectonic plates rearranged the planet's continents. There were no plants of any kind on land anywhere on Earth at this point, meaning the ground surrounding these shallow seas would have been barren rock and sediment, entirely unlike the forested or vegetated landscapes we associate with almost every other period of Earth's history. Global temperatures ran hot enough that there was no polar ice anywhere on the planet, which kept sea levels high and allowed shallow, life-friendly water to spread much further across the continents than it does in the modern world. A second major discovery, reported by CNN in July 2025, added an entirely new layer of fossil evidence from a different part of the canyon's Cambrian rock. A research team that included Cambridge University doctoral student Giovanni Mussini focused on the Bright Angel Formation, a flaky, clay-rich shale layer where most of the canyon's Cambrian fossils have historically been found. Rather than searching only for the hard-shelled trilobites and shelled invertebrates typical of the region, the team dissolved rock, samples in acid back in the lab, a process that destroys the mineral matrix of the rock while leaving certain organic and microscopic fossil material intact. What emerged were thousands of tiny fossils the team hadn't expected to find in this kind of preservation, including soft-bodied organisms that don't normally survive the fossilization process at all. According to Stanford University's Eric Sperling, who studies Cambrian ecosystems but wasn't involved in this particular study, the sea covering what is now the Grand Canyon sat at what researchers are calling a Goldilocks depth, shallow enough to stay oxygen-rich, but deep enough to preserve delicate fossil material that would normally be destroyed by wave action or scavengers in truly shallow water. That specific combination of conditions is a major reason the Grand Canyon has become one of the most important single locations on the planet for understanding exactly how this evolutionary explosion unfolded. Soft-bodied fossils like the ones Mussini's team recovered are exceptionally rare in the geological record precisely because soft tissue almost never survives long enough to fossilize under normal conditions. It typically decomposes or gets scavenged within days, long before mineral replacement can lock its shape into stone. Finding thousands of these delicate fossils preserved together in a single formation gives researchers something hard-shelled trilobites. Alone could never provide direct physical evidence of the soft internal anatomy, feeding structures and body forms of Cambrian organisms that would otherwise be represented only by fragments of shell or the faint outlines of their tracks and burrows. While the Cambrian layers were being re-examined near the top of the canyon's rock record, a completely separate team was digging into the very bottom of it, into rock nearly 3 times older than anything from the Cambrian period. Suzanne Autry Mulligan, an assistant professor of geology at Northern Illinois University, led a study focused on the 1.7 billion-year-old metamorphic schists and gneisses that make up the canyon's crystalline basement, the deepest, oldest rock exposed anywhere in the Grand Canyon's upper granite gorge. Published in the journal Geology, her team's research used a technique called quartz in garnet barometry, essentially measuring residual pressure trapped inside microscopic garnet crystals using a laser-based Raman spectrometer to reconstruct the exact depths at which these ancient rocks originally formed inside the Earth's crust. Previous generations of researchers working on the same basement rock had access only to tools that measured temperature changes recorded within the rock's minerals, which gave an incomplete picture of the pressures those minerals had actually experienced. Autry Mulligan's team's use of quartz and garnet barometry solved that gap by measuring residual strain locked inside microscopic quartz inclusions trapped within larger garnet crystals, a technique that effectively works like a tiny pressure gauge frozen in stone for 7 billion years, finally letting researchers calculate burial depth with genuine precision rather than rough estimation. The results directly challenged a long-standing assumption. Geologists had generally treated the 43-mile stretch of exposed basement rock in the upper granite gorge as a single block that was buried and later pushed back to the surface as one unified package. Autry Mulligan's pressure data told a different story. One sampled section, described as a hot block, had reached pressures of about 7 kilobars, while a neighboring cold block sample never exceeded 5 kilobars, a roughly 2 kilobar difference that indicates these sections of rock followed genuinely different burial and uplift paths through the Earth's crust, rather than moving together as a single coherent slab. That distinction matters because it reshapes the tectonic history of how this part of North America's continental crust originally assembled itself more than 1.5 billion years ago, long before anything resembling modern plate boundaries existed in their current form. This basement rock sits directly beneath one of the most famous unsolved puzzles in American geology, a feature called the Great Unconformity, where much younger Cambrian sedimentary rock rests directly on top of basement stone that can be more than 1 billion years older, with no record at all of what happened during the enormous gap of time in between. In some sections of the canyon near Lake Mead, that basement rock is dated between 1, 4, and 1, 8 billion years old, while the sedimentary layers sitting directly on top of it are only about 520 million years old. Researchers, including a team led by Olivia Thurston during an 11-day raft expedition down the Colorado River, have used a technique called thermochronology, which tracks the thermal history recorded inside mineral grains to try to reconstruct what happened during that missing time. Their work suggests the eastern and western halves of the ancient Grand Canyon region were pulled apart differently during the breakup of an early supercontinent called Rodinia roughly 700 million years ago, with the western basement rock rising to the surface while the eastern portion remained buried under kilometers of additional sediment, a geological divorce that helped carve out the missing chapter. Geologists have puzzled over for well over a century. The Great Unconformity isn't unique to the Grand Canyon either. Similar gaps in the rock record, representing missing spans of hundreds of millions to more than 1 billion years, have been documented at sites across North America, which suggests whatever geological process erased this stretch of time operated on a truly continental scale rather than being some strange local anomaly confined to one canyon. Some researchers have connected the Great Unconformity to a much larger and more extreme event known as Snowball Earth, a period when much of the planet may have been covered in glacial ice, with the massive erosional power of advancing and retreating ice sheets potentially scraping away enormous thicknesses of rock that had accumulated over the preceding billion years. though this remains an area of active scientific investigation rather than settled fact. What is settled is that whatever process caused it, the missing time recorded in the Grand Canyon's rock represents one of the most dramatic gaps in Earth's entire geological record, an erased chapter, sitting directly beneath the layers that would later capture the explosion of animal life above it. It's worth being direct about something here. Searches for Grand Canyon discoveries that rewrite history often surface a much older, much less credible story. An article published by an Arizona newspaper back in 1909 describing a supposed hidden cave system deep within the canyon containing Egyptian and Tibetan-style artifacts, mummified remains, and chambers carved by some unknown ancient civilization. That story has circulated online for over a century, but no verified archaeological record, no museum collection, no peer-reviewed excavation report, and no credible historical account has ever confirmed that the expedition described in that 1909 article actually took place as written. It remains, by every standard historians and archaeologists apply to evaluating a claim like this, an unverified and almost certainly fabricated newspaper story rather than a genuine discovery. No Smithsonian expedition record confirms it, despite persistent online claims connecting the story to that institution. No physical artifact from the supposed expedition has ever surfaced in any museum collection anywhere in the world. And no follow-up reporting from the era, at a time when American newspapers regularly covered archaeological expeditions in detail, ever corroborated the original account. The story has simply been repeated, reshared, and dramatized online for well over a century, gaining new momentum with every retelling despite never gaining a single piece of new supporting evidence along the way. The Grand Canyon does hold a remarkable, well-documented human history, including indigenous dwellings built directly into the canyon walls, ceremonial sites, ancient stone tools, and evidence of long-established trade routes stretching back thousands of years, all of it real, all of it documented by legitimate archaeological fieldwork. But none of that history involves lost Egyptian civilizations buried beneath the rock. What actually is buried beneath the Grand Canyon, verified by peer-reviewed research, published in major geological journals, and confirmed through multiple independent dating techniques, is something considerably more significant than a hoax from over a century ago. It is a nearly 2 billion year continuous record of Earth's deep history, layered directly on top of itself like the pages of a book nobody has finished reading. At the bottom sits basement rock recording the violent assembly of the North American continent through volcanic island collisions, 7 billion years ago. Above that sits a billion-year gap where an entire supercontinent tore itself apart, leaving almost no trace behind. And above that sits the Tonto Group and the Bright Angel Formation, 540 million-year-old rock that captured in extraordinary and increasingly precise detail the exact moment complex animal life exploded into existence across the planet's oceans, the same evolutionary moment that eventually, across hundreds of millions of years and countless intermediate species, led to every vertebrate creature alive today, humans very much included. That is the actual story hiding in the canyon walls. Not a secret civilization, not a hidden chamber sealed off from the public, a 540 million-year-old fossil record, sitting in plain sight along one of the most heavily visited and extensively studied rock formations on the planet, that scientists are still actively rereading with better tools every single year, and which keeps forcing them to rewrite what they thought they already understood about how life, including our own distant evolutionary origins, actually began, one carefully dated crystal at a time. Consider the time scale involved one more time before drawing any conclusions about what these rocks actually represent. The basement layer alone recorded the violent birth of a continent nearly 2 billion years before a single human being walked the Earth. The gap above it swallowed an entire supercontinent's breakup without leaving so much as a fossil behind to explain how. And the layer above that captured in a window shorter than the time separating today from the last ice age relative to the planet's full history, the moment when nearly every animal body plan alive today first took shape in shallow water that has long since evaporated. Every one of those chapters is still being actively reread, using tools that improve year over year, which means the story locked inside the Grand Canyon's walls has not finished being told. The next research season, using whatever new dating or imaging technique becomes available next, could just as easily rewrite this account all over again. And unlike the century-old hoax that keeps resurfacing online, that rewrite will come with a peer-reviewed paper, a named research team, and evidence anyone can go verify for themselves.